Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that sits right at the very edge of human understanding, literally, the disappearance of the self. We're going to look at those extreme states across neurology, psychology, and spirituality where the conscious I just vanishes. We're going to map out that void together, and more importantly, we're going to see what happens when someone actually comes back from it.
I want you to imagine for a second what actually remains when your physical awareness, your carefully built psychological identity, or even your deepest spiritual anchor just completely drops away. Seriously, when the whole framework you use to define you disappears, is there anything left sitting in the dark? To figure that out, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We'll start with losing the self, move into the medical void, explore the psychological ego death, touch on the spiritual dark night, and wrap up with emerging transformed. Section 1. Losing the self. Now, whether we're talking about medicine, psychology, or theology, this descent into the unknown always kicks off the exact same way, with a really sudden, abrupt departure from normal waking consciousness.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core difference here. On one hand, you've got literal physical death, or a medical loss of consciousness. Basically a biological shutdown, right? But on the flip side, we have what Carl Jung famously called psychic death. Now, this isn't your body shutting down. Instead, it's this fundamental transformation where the ego dies, which then allows your deeper, more natural self to actually emerge. Section 2. The medical void. Let's start with the ultimate physical manifestation of losing yourself, the hard, undeniable medical reality of falling into a coma. When a patient slips into an anoxic ischemic coma, say right after a cardiac arrest, they are basically entering a total medical wilderness. And to navigate this, doctors follow a super strict timeline. They'll wait a minimum of 72 hours post-resuscitation before making any absolute, irreversible decisions about recovery. Why? Well, the brain literally needs time to clear the chaos. They're checking for specific electrical signals at the 24-hour mark, they monitor for involuntary muscle movements around 48 hours, and by 72 hours, they're testing those foundational brainstem reflexes. You can think of these physical signs as literal breadcrumbs in the void. For instance, favorable signs include things like intact pupillary reflexes and normal bilateral N20 somatosensory evoked potentials. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but essentially, those are just electrical signals traveling from your nerves right up to your brain. If those signals are making the trip normally, there is a clear path back. On the other hand, unfavorable signs like status myoclonus, which are these continuous muscle jerks, or a total lack of those electrical signals, well, that points to a much darker prognosis.
I really want to pause and emphasize this striking statistic right here, 99.7%. In the medical literature, if those bilateral N20 cortical responses are completely absent after a cardiac arrest, there is a 99.7% certainty that the patient will not recover. In this context, the physical you is profoundly tethered to these specific electrical pathways. Without them, the biological self just cannot find its way back from the void. Section 3. The psychological ego death. So let's pivot from the involuntary medical void to something entirely different, the psychological and sometimes voluntary loss of identity. This brings us to a concept you might have heard of, ego death. It's essentially the complete loss of your subjective self-identity. Researchers back in the 1960s psychedelic movement, guys like Timothy Leary and Stanislav Grof, studied this extensively. Grof actually described it as the irreversible end to the skin-encapsulated ego. It's that profound, overwhelming sensation where the barrier between you and the rest of the universe just completely dissolves. To really grasp the psychological weight of this, it helps to look at mythology. Joseph Campbell famously mapped out the hero's journey, and he showed that this ego death is actually a universal, mythological phase of self-surrender. The hero literally has to leave the normal waking world, descend into the underworld, and let their old identity die. It's a terrifying but absolutely crucial transition if true transformation is going to happen. Now, what's absolutely wild about this is how modern science actually backs up this psychological death. Using functional MRIs, neuroscientists can track ego dissolution right down to specific neurochemical shifts in your brain. It turns out, psychedelics stimulate the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, which creates this indirect surge of glutamate. But here is the kicker. It decreases connectivity in the default mode network. That's the exact network in your brain responsible for your sense of self and your running internal monologue. So the ego dies because its biological hardware gets temporarily unplugged. Section 4. The spiritual dark night. We've looked at the body, we've looked at the mind. Now let's look at theology. Because for centuries, mystics didn't need MRIs or heart monitors to map out the void. And this is where these disciplines really start to overlap in these so-called liminal spaces. The 16th century Carmelite monk John of the Cross famously wrote about the dark night of the soul. He mapped out this incredibly painful process of being stripped completely bare, losing all your routine reality and earthly desires, just to reach an ultimate union with the divine. It's a profound space where a deep spiritual crisis can honestly look terrifyingly similar to modern clinical depression or a complete psychological breakdown. So the crucial point here is how ancient texts actually localize this whole experience. While modern science is hyper-focused on the brain, biblical texts refer to the heart. But, and this is key, they don't just mean your feelings. The biblical heart is much closer to the Greek concept of nous, or the mind. It's viewed as the true center of human cognition, stamina, and willpower. In this framework, it's the heart, not just the physical brain, that enters that dark night. When deep in this spiritual void, the mystic experiences what's called infused contemplation. And this operates on 3 incredibly specific features. It happens completely without active reasoning, it lacks specific concepts or ideas, and it operates entirely independent of human willpower. Honestly, notice how incredibly similar this sounds to the psychedelic ego death we just talked about. The standard operating powers of your soul, what Timothy Leary called routine game reality, are totally, completely suspended. Section 5. Emerging transformed. This brings us to the final phase of our narrative arc. Because descending into the void, that's really only half the story. The ultimate question is what happens when someone finally returns from that medical, psychological, or spiritual darkness. And beautifully enough, neurology perfectly overlaps with psychological recovery right here. As a patient emerges from a minimally conscious state, their brain networks physically rebuild the self. We literally see the exact opposite of ego death happening. Overall brain metabolism rises, gray matter volume actually increases, and connectivity within that vital default mode network, the U network, comes right back online. The physical hardware is re-establishing the self. This return is the ultimate culmination of the hero's journey, and it mirrors the final stage of the Tibetan bardo. Whether it's a patient waking up from a prolonged medical coma, a psychological voyager coming back from an ego death, or a mystic emerging from the dark night of the soul, they all return to routine reality. But, and this is the whole point, they don't come back empty-handed. They emerge fundamentally transformed, bringing these incredibly enriched, profound discoveries back into the waking world with them. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative question. Based on all the multidisciplinary evidence we've just unpacked in this explainer, what exactly are you? Are you really just electrical signals pulsing through a prefrontal cortex? Are you a psychological narrative that can somehow be paused and restarted? Or are you a spiritual anchor rooted in something much, much deeper? I'll leave you to ponder the true nature of your own identity. Thanks so much for joining me on this incredible journey.